All right, take it away, Sarah.
Hell yeah. Woo! Hell
Yeah.
That was great. That was amazing.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Thanks everybody for coming. Welcome to Endgame, where we're going to talk about the future, where the world's going, how afraid we are, or how optimistic we are. Our guest this week is PK, who's involved with a lot of awesome art around here. So actually, PK, I want to talk to you first just about, in general, what your feeling of the future is. Like if you are sort of optimistic or pessimistic about where we're going.
I'm both. I don't know if I'm neither or both. I guess I'm both. I'm optimistic in many ways, and I'm also very pessimistic seeing the current state. But probably think it's a hump and we'll get over it. And I'm fairly optimistic, I guess.
If it's a hump that we're going to get over, it's going to be pretty incredible on the other side, right?
It's going to be a roller coaster ride.
Can you imagine 100 years in the future, what you might be doing?
50 years, maybe. 100 years seems impossible. I just think it's going to be so radically different. We're going to probably not age. We're going to have all our brains wired together. I don't know. It's too far in the future.
You imagine our brains are going to get linked up in some way? Or are you imagining sort of a hive mind?
I think we'll still be individuals, but I think there will be a lot of more interactivity between our brains. So it's really hard to know how humanity will reject certain parts of this. Like it might fight back, but I think certain things are inevitable. But then when you count in all this machine intelligence, like, are they going to be taking care of us? Are they going to just put us in zoos? Like, are we going to become parts of the machine? So it's really hard to know. I think it's optimistic we'll have less war, but whether humans will be a big part of that future in 100 years' time, I'm not sure.
Let me ask you this. How do you imagine it's going to look if we're communicating through some kind of technology, telepathy type thing? If we're in a hive or if we're linked through the internet and I'm sending information from my brain to your brain, are you seeing that in your mind's eye? How do you imagine that being perceived?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, one thing I think could happen is not our generation, but the generations who grow up with this technology from when they're children, I think there could at first be some sort of extra layer to speech. Like the kids will start speaking to each other, but there'll be a kind of an emotional connection between some kind of neural link. And so it'll just be part of their language that the older generation won't even understand. Maybe
But don't we already have
I don't know, it'd be
that?
people who don't know sarcasm to try and talk with us with all our extra layers.
The mirror neurons and things like that. Right now when you interact with someone else, we do mimic each other with motor neurons, like our posture and things like that. And then you feel. We just watched a video today in class where people mimicked each other. I actually wanted to try this at some point in VR, but you try to you go up to someone and put your hand to them, and then you try to move your hand as they're moving their hand. And you have this whole connection, this whole empathetic connection. So it's interesting that you're talking about building upon that, and that if it's integrated with the internet, when we're communicating with one another, that would be amplified. That kind of makes sense. I think already notifications and things on our phones, do that. But also, I think you mentioned the lack of visual cues.
Should we maybe try the exercise first before we start talking about it?
Let's do that, and then we'll explain what we're sort of talking about. So we're going to run a little exercise that's going to require you guys to participate in a small way. You're going to have to actually close your eyes, and you're going to have to imagine something in your mind. I'm going to give you a couple of things to think about. So imagine that you're in your childhood home, and you're looking at the walls, and you're noticing the color of the paint, or if it's wallpaper, or the style of the wallpaper. And you see there's pictures on the wall, portraits of very familiar people, maybe family members, maybe your old friends. And you spend some time just staring at them. They stare back at you. And then your mom calls you in from the kitchen. You go to the kitchen, and she's sitting there at a table with Bill Gates. And they're both dressed formally in all black. And Bill Gates has set up an old-fashioned beige computer on the table. And he's describing how to use it to your mom. He reaches into the screen as if it was a portal and grabs something on the other side. He pulls out Kermit the Frog, who does a little dance, and he smiles for everybody. All right, now come back. So the question is, what were you able to sort of see when I was describing that to you? There's a lot of different images there, and it may seem obvious to everyone, but we actually might be experiencing it in very different ways.
Yeah, so let's do emojis. Maybe let's do what would be the first scene? like the in the childhood home with the portraits, with the pictures looking back at you?
Yeah, let's talk about like the imagery that's from your own life that you had to pull from your memory. So give a thumbs up if you were able to clearly pull that up in your mind and you can see it clearly in your head. Give a thumbs down if you can't actually see it in your head. You're just pulling up ideas. DK, you might be the only one. Oh, there's one other.
I want to ask specifically about the mother at the kitchen table. Let's take a vote on that. If you could visualize your mother at the kitchen table, or if that got a lot harder, you know, to visualize. Okay, so still about the same. And then what about when Bill Gates appeared? How are we feeling? I was like,
can't visualize
I had
Bill
no idea
Gates?
what it looked like. I mean,
Oh, I've got a solid picture of him in my
I have
head.
face blindness, so we can talk about that too.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
wow.
but it's kind of a blindness in a way. But okay, and then the beige computer, when the beige computer came out, like lower people, that was pretty low, I feel like, on that. Interesting.
Oh, I'm
Okay,
learning
and
something about
then
you,
I
Psych.
guess was
Kermit.
I know Kermit the Frog, and like who in the audience was the one, if you feel comfortable talking about what you saw? When did it get blurry, or could you visualize any of that, or how? Yeah, what was that experience like for you?
The only visualization that I could actually clearly see would be pretty much like the beige computer, and of course, with the frog jumping out of it. It's difficult for me to actually visualize the room. Like, I can feel like, yeah, there's a room, but I can't really give you a visualization of it or a description of how it looked. Like when you said like Bill Gates, like my brain would say, oh, there's Bill Gates at that point, but but I don't see like a solid visual image of Bill Gates in it. It would just be like something I know it to be that, but I don't really see it.
And this is tricky to discuss because I like this aphantasia, not seeing anything in your mind's eye, or it's like a spectrum. So when people said to picture something in their head, I thought it was a metaphor, as did a lot of other people. Although I kind of felt like I did see things. Like if I think of trees and green, I feel like I know green. But when I focus on it, it's just like gray blobs. It's not like you construct some sort of imagery, but when you try and look closely, it just disappears. There's nothing there.
It's almost like rendering. It's like foveated rendering in our mind or something. It's like you're not focused on it as much, and so you actually can't draw up the details, but it's saving some processing power.
I feel like I'm somewhere in the middle, like on that spectrum, probably leaning a little bit towards you, where it's like not very clear to me. I wonder if there's anyone who's like what's it called if they're hyperphantasiacs?
Do any of you see like everything like you can look back and it's a picture, you can see out every little detail? Yeah. Do you also have really clear dreams, and like when you dream, is it very vivid? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm curious about Sir Oblivious too. Sir Oblivious, what about your dreams and stuff? Do you feel like your ability to your imagery, I guess, can we define aphantasia or aphantasia? How do we?
It's the blindness of the mind's eye, whatever that means. It basically means like it's hard to picture stuff, or impossible to actually picture things in your head.
Yeah, 2% in the 2015 study, 2% of the people that they sampled. I don't remember the details.
And 2% would make sense in this room. I mean, like if there's only like one person in here, basically, like that's about right.
For me, what I feel like is because I'm learning I don't have these internal visuals, it makes sense why I like all this external input, visual input, and I like 3D movies a lot. Like a lot of my friends, they find it a gimmick, but for me, it's such a huge difference. I think people who have really clear visuals, and maybe gamers, I think might be very good at this. But like basically, you can look at a screen, and then your mind creates this virtual reality in your head. So I don't have that. So for me, 3D movies help a lot. VR was just such a huge difference. Like I couldn't understand why it wasn't so obvious to some people. I was curious if in the early adopters of social VR, if there was a higher percentage of people who lack this, but it doesn't seem like over here. It seems like this is a pretty normal group of people in this regard.
It's just a bunch of regular.
Well, I'm curious. We talked about this, Sir Oblivious. Where do you think you fall on this?
In terms of like dreams, what you mentioned before, they would sometimes be clear, but at the same time, they would be very abstract or strange and not necessarily focus on a single image at one time. There would be like maybe more than one image happening at the same time, melding into each other, and I wouldn't be able to recognize the difference between them all.
Some people with aphantasia have really good memory for certain things, and it's not just visuals. It's like you could be stronger in other things. So it's like some people, I mean, use symbols. Some people speak everything in their head. It's all like dialogue. And there's people have different ways. It seems like some people still have really good memories or better in some ways. But I know for me, it's like in some ways I have just a terrible memory because I can't do this sort of recall.
It depends on how you define memory, right? Because like your visual memory and your recall visual objects might not be as good, but your brain might have compensated for that in other ways. So you might be a lot better at, like, I think I'm actually pretty bad with faces. Like if everyone's face looks, it's prosopagnosia. I have like a mild form of that, and people really look the same to me generally. Like when I meet them, I can't really tell them apart. And so my memory of people's faces is really bad. Like I can't really imagine Bill Gates' face or really any, like I think my family and close friends I can. But when people ask me to imagine that, it's lacking. But when I imagine objects or other things that I've somehow processed more deeply or been able to remember, I can visualize it pretty well. Anything you visualize is from the past, essentially. I mean, I think it's very hard to create new visualizations unless you combine them in new ways or something. But so it's all going through the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain responsible for memory. So perhaps, certain people have more visual parts of their brain working with the hippocampus versus other parts of the brain. I'm not a neuroscientist or anything, so I'm probably watching the sequences or something, but I know in general the hippocampus is for memory. So.
The reason I found this kind of mind-blowing is that it's just very revealing in the ways that we think so differently from each other. Like, obviously, we all don't think in the same way, but it's even more diverse than I sort of imagined. And so, like, when we're talking about the future and neural lace and the hive mind, I always just assumed it would be like the Matrix. It was, like, very obvious to me. You just plug something in, and then there's a movie playing in your head. Obviously, everyone can do that. And then that's your virtual reality, right? Like, and like Lau has that in his book. But like, what if your brain doesn't work that way? Like, is technology going to be able to power through that in some way? It's something I just never considered before.
In cognitive therapy, I'm in a cognitive therapy class, and one of my classmates actually brought up the point, like, is this mind control? Like, are you just teaching someone, like, what's the difference between teaching someone to think differently so that they don't have negative emotions versus just telling them what to think? You're getting at the same concept here, where it's like, how much agency do we have over our own cognitions? But PK, what do you think? Are you or anyone? Yeah, Mr. Pinky, you've been
Mr. Pinky
in the center.
Well, before you guys stepped away from the having problems processing images in your head, we've talked about it before. I don't even remember having dreams when I wake up. So I can't like wake up and go, oh, I should think about what I just had a dream about. I wake up and it's like there's nothing happened before that. But growing up and even now still, if I read something like say like a fantasy adventure book or something like that, I can visualize all kinds of crazy stuff that's in the story in my head, and like it's like I'm watching the movie play out of what I'm reading. And then also when you were doing the you're looking at the wall and the paint and the pictures and all that stuff, I couldn't visualize anything until all of a sudden it just popped to me to say, oh, my grandparents' house. And as soon as my brain said grandparents' house, I was in a specific bedroom in the house, looking at specific pictures that are probably still on the walls in that bedroom, and then walking out to the kitchen and seeing my mom with a haircut she had when I was really, really young, and then Bill Gates and Kermit.
Was it more a lack of image, or was it more that your brain was, do you think that you were thinking in a more, in a less imaginary way, in a more concrete verbal?
I was more focused on childhood home, I think, is what it was. I don't have like a specific childhood home, but my grandparents' house was always an anchor point growing up. I've taken aptitude tests in the past where they have a series of gears and it says, this one goes this way. Which way does this one go? Instead of just drawing a line on the paper of which way the gears turn, in my head, I focus on the gears actually physically spinning in my head. I mean, that's a for instance, but mechanically things like that work for me as well. But I still go back to, I don't remember my dreams.
Have you talked about that? Like, how do you see your dreams?
It's really hard to answer because I feel like I dream less and less. I think my dreams are more like conversations. I don't think they're very visual. I haven't done psychedelics in many years, but I think one reason I enjoyed them so much. I mean, like once a year back when I actually tried mushrooms, I think they were actually giving me proper internal visuals. So I think but I'm not even sure. Like maybe I should try some again. Anybody got some?
Someone in the audience has got to have some.
He reminded me of something else. Another thing about this that I'd like to read this. So somebody wrote here, descriptive language in novels was important to her, but impotent to me. I skip it as reflexively as you skip the iTunes terms of service. So here's an example. The slender, olive-skinned man brushed the golden locks out of his hazel eyes. He was so focused on preparing for the assassination that he burned his tongue on the scalding cup of joe, hazelnut like cream. And then he wrote after, that becomes, there's an assassin. So that's what he got out of it. And I feel I'm the same way. I'm curious if people like reading a fiction, and especially like fantasy, has never really been that compelling to me. Lousy I'm curious about his viewpoint on this because you're a writer and it's meaningless to people like me. So
yeah, so I think one of the tricks you learn about details in writing, specifically as you do it more, is actually you don't need that level of detail. Like the level of detail you described is almost overwhelming.
But wouldn't one of the things be perfect?
Well, it depends. So I think one of the things when you're just starting out as a writer, you're very focused on wanting to present a very specific visual. It's like important, like you have to know, that this character's suit is black and it has buttons and it has all these, like you feel like you have to convey a very precise image in order to convey your story. And in most cases, that's actually not true. I think a good example is Harry Potter when they did the stage play. Hermione was dark skinned and there was a big outcry. She's white, right? But then J.K. Rowling went and pointed out, all I said is she had curly hair and there was not a skin color described. It was just curly hair and a clever smile or something. So one of the things you learn as a writer after you've been doing it a while is you only have to fill in a few details. You don't have to fill in everything because it's okay if everyone sees something different, as long as you see something, right? So detail-wise, I think the sample that you mentioned had too much detail, and
I think it would attract certain audiences, though. I think your writing style. But you're right. I think you can do a lot.
There's definitely a balance, and some descriptions are really neat. Like I think one of the things with fantasy, often when you get to maybe a cool place, you will describe it in a little more detail because that's what people read for. So some people do read fantasy for the really cool descriptions of like once, but describing mundane things, like you really don't need to. Like unless the sword is special, it's just a sword.
Well, I kind of want to continue with another example similar to that, just pulling from Lau's Loose Circuit. So, like, if you're not following Loose Circuit, it's an episodic serial that we're digesting on the internet. And there's an advertisement.
I don't really talk about it much, and I don't really promote it anywhere.
I'm going to read an excerpt. This is part of the opening. This is like the opening chapter. So I'm just going to read this out loud. So again, let's all close our eyes, go back to your mind's eye, and you're going to try and bring up this imagery in your head, and we'll see what happens. Ventura Visions was an office like any other in San Diego. An orderly mess of tinted glass and polished metal and clean, inoffensive concrete. It overlooked the bay and the clear blue sky and the fluffy clouds on the horizon. And there was a detective standing in the front of it. His name was Forrester. Detective Forrester was dark-skinned, 3 meters tall, and built like a linebacker. Wore dark slacks, a sterile blue blazer, and a long graphene trench coat that wasn't standard but didn't break any laws. He had a metal hand and a clean bald head, and the tag floating above his head, in augmented reality, of course, read Forrester, CID. Okay, now come back. So I'm curious, without giving any more explanation, if anyone can recall like what information that gives them. Like, what are they picturing in their head?
With the descriptions, it sounded like kind of a rather stern individual, kind of very serious.
Wait, Catapult, did you also have something?
Yeah, I didn't see a darn thing.
So I'm kind of similar.
I'm going to retire now.
This is not a failure on your part, but it's the thing where the description, similar to the description of that assassin, like I have a lot of difficulty actually building that up in my mind. I get more of a feeling. So similar to what you said, right? Like I get a feeling from Forrester, and that feeling will remain as I continue reading and I'll connect it to the character. but I'll forget the specifics. And so at the end of chapter 2 or 3 or whatever, there's like a picture of him and he's black. I was like, what the fuck? It's similar to like the Hermione thing or whatever. It's like, I forgot like the details of the description, right? Because like it didn't impact me in that way.
A big part of this, like for me, like those scenes in even audiobooks, which is how I prefer, those are really hard. Sometimes I have to go over them a few times when people are describing the scene. But the thing with people with aphantasia, it's not necessarily that you're what's the word, handicapped necessarily, maybe in that way, but you make up for in other senses. Like for me, like if you guys imagine petting a cat, can you feel the fur? Like for me, my simulation of touch feels very accurate. Like I think my brain prioritizes different senses to internal sight. The brain is kind of balanced in a certain way. So if you don't have really great internal visuals, you may be very good at, like with music, I can kind of hear the songs, not super clear, but I can hear them a bit. And some people can hear every single note. So I'm curious what people have in terms of other senses.
When you talk about petting the cat, I can just get an image in my head. But when you say that you can feel it, like you can tell, the fur or whatever,
it's not.
That's mind-boggling.
It's not quite like. It's not exactly the same as touching it, but I can feel it on my hand a bit. Like it's a very good simulation, I think.
That's interesting because that's proprioception, which is another sense. So that's where your brain might be making up for lack of visual ability to visualize outside of what you're seeing. Another interesting thing you said too a while back is that you're glad that you have virtual reality to be able to see the things around you. Some theories of consciousness and embodied consciousness talk about how we're already in a virtual reality in the real world, and our brain is actually rendering the environment and rendering the sensations and the vibrations and everything around us. So it's interesting. You're in VR within VR.
The way I look at it, it's a matter of whether you care about the subject or not. If you're really passionate about it, you'll be able to see a heck of a lot more. But if you really don't care, then you won't even bother looking.
Maybe. Like, I wonder if I've gotten tired over time, because as a teenager, I think I did get more out of descriptions of like visual stuff in science fiction books. And now I sort of just skip over them. Like, they mean nothing to me. And I wonder if it's just my brain has gotten lazier, or if I just care less, like you're saying.
For me personally, I don't read books for the simple reason that my attention span sucks. So I have to reread the same paragraph 5 or 6 times before I start cluing in. It's kind of like I'll read and my mind will start wandering someplace else. But the other thing too, the first example, when the child and you're back into your childhood house, and that there's a thing that Psych would probably be able to answer there. It depends on if person's got walls. Personally, I didn't want to go back to my childhood, so I didn't even bother.
And so did you think about anything or visualize anything during that exercise?
Not a thing. I didn't want to go there, and I wasn't going there.
One time I showed patients Google Earth in rehab or whatever, and they went to Street View, and it was a very similar experience. Some patients enjoyed it, and other patients actually didn't enjoy it. And people in general want to go. People would choose to go to different places. I might choose to go where I used to vacation, or whatever. Like, people would choose different locations. So again, that's also tied into this idea of imagery and choosing what prompts we want and what prompts we don't want. And it's kind of about the pink elephant. Sorry, this is kind of remarkable, but the pink elephant, telling everyone not to think about a pink elephant right now. So how many of us are visualizing a pink elephant, and the details of that visualization might reveal where we fall on that spectrum that we're talking about.
Okay. So I'd have to say I'm on the complete opposite end of PK here. Like, I can remember what it feels like to be in that scene of the house scene that you guys gave in front, and I can see exactly what Lau was talking about in his book. But it seems like the longer I think about it, the more detailed it gets. Like, the more I generate or pull from memory.
Interesting.
Because I can think about it now. I don't remember my house very much, but the longer I think about it, I know exactly where everything is, what we used to do.
So envious of that superpower.
It does sound like a power.
Going farther back to when Nomono was talking about the Matrix. If you ask somebody to remember an entire show and play it back to themselves in their head, it's very difficult. Whereas, like music, it's only audio. You don't have to remember video or emotion or anything like that. You can generate those on the fly. Whereas if you try to, remember a movie, you have to generate, the feeling that was conveyed, the video that
I don't
was
know if I'd
conveyed,
agree with
and
that.
the audio that was conveyed.
There's a lot of associations with music for me.
Well, what do you get?
I do that as well.
It's hard. For me with music, it's like, it's also more conceptual, but there's like shapes, the texture. Like when I listen to somebody singing, I have a hard time focusing on the lyrics because I'm so focused on the texture of their voice, the melody, the rhythms. And then you have all this nostalgia mixed in. And I mean, sometimes it's less nostalgic, but I don't know, for me, it's still a very complex calculation.
I think it's less obvious than something as simple as saying like you think in I think that I sort of think in movies where like I picture things as scenes with like camera angles, but like it's not like that's just programmed into me and I think like a movie and it's that easily said, right? There's a complicated mix of stuff going on that I'm feeling that it's hard to describe, but like that's just so that sort of is going to go back. Oh, actually, before I go back to that, I'll let Sarah.
So if someone says imagine, I can visualize. If they say to imagine a feel, smell, taste, etc., I do so. It feels weird to me now that others don't. I thought most did.
Aren't you sad for everyone else, Sarah? Like you and Ghoster seem to have this super sense thing. No?
But there's an argument to be made. In a way, it is kind of a superpower, but at the same time, somebody said it's actually like, what do they call it, a dirty scratch pad? Or it's just like, it's giving you all these details. You're inventing this whole thing. It may actually not be as accurate as somebody who's forced to remember and describe things without the visual components. It depends.
So one of the downsides, though, that Sarah mentions about that superpower is she remembers the bad, too. So in a way, you remember the bad
more viscerally.
Kind of a downside.
Would either of you describe that as like a photographic memory or something, or is that a totally different idea?
I learn more by, doing it. I'm more of those, if I
that helps me a lot, doing it.
I think that's common to most people, though. I think we learn better by doing than by hearing. I don't think that's unique.
Some people can see an action and then simulate in their head. It's so clear that they can that's a talent. I don't know how natural that is, but for me, it's like when people told me at a job, try to teach me how to tie a rope, and I got so frustrated when they didn't let me try it a few times because just seeing it does not imprint. But you're right, that's a fairly common thing.
It's an analytical mind. A person, they can view complex machinery in their mind, like rebuilding a racing engine and stuff like that. They see it all in their mind, and then they turn around and they do it.
To add on to that and about how different people's minds are more capable of processing different amounts of information in varying detail. For a perfect example, just look at a person like Stephen Hawking, who has to rely on his mind and can do all these very complex calculations.
Yeah, that kind of brings me back to, you were calling it a lack of something. I forget what the example was, but like we'll lack different senses and then maybe make up for it in different ways or whatever. Yeah. Do we have a definition of what is typical for a brain, like the way that you're supposed to think and the amount that you're supposed to be able to visualize? Like, or are we all just, is it a scattered spectrum where it's just, we're all making do with a bunch of different variables and arriving at a similar type of software in our head?
I guess.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I understand what you're asking, and I don't think we actually know the answer, but I think one clue that gives us some insight is the idea that our bodies, our brain, every cell in our body is made up of DNA. And so DNA manifests itself physically. We all look different in appearance. So, people can vary pretty widely on their height and their features and their skin color and things like that. So what the visual part, how we vary there, probably is some kind of similar distribution of randomness that people, who've evolved differently, maybe have slightly different brains. I don't know the answer, but there's probably whole theories about this, like in philosophy and stuff about cognition and consciousness. So people probably devote their lives to trying to answer this question.
If anybody has some good philosophy, step forward.
Yeah.
Can I talk about synesthesia a bit, unless somebody has a comment? And then we could, that'll kind of lead us to the future. There's a lot of really good evidence that says that when we're born, our senses are all kind of mixed together. Like a baby, when they hear something, they may also see colors, and it's not not separated very well. And so you can kind of see this in babies too. They look overwhelmed by these things. And so the theory is that as we grow older, like even by 8 months, between 3 and 8 months is a huge change. And so our senses starts pruning, then it separates. And then some people keep certain senses crossed, and then it reinforces as they get older, synesthesia. So some people, and some of them aren't as obvious, like Einstein's brain, when they looked at it, looked pretty similar, except there's more gray matter. It was easier to cross between the mathematic and creative side of the brain, is the theory. So I'm curious if anybody here has synesthesia of a kind, and also would you, if in the future you could remove that, or you could combine certain senses, and would you want to alter yourself in that way?
Oh, that's interesting. Anybody want to admit to being a synesthetic, or what do you call somebody with synesthesia? I have a friend who says that like letters and words have like attitudes and emotions. Like she'll see a letter and she has a feeling that it's like angry or something. Like that's her sort of weird form of it.
I think a lot of people have levels of it. Like some people, they have that from when they're a baby, but I think we can develop these connections between certain things. If we do something like a job over and over and over, I think your brain just starts combining certain parts of the brain, and it's a version of that.
So like when he talks about this pruning process, Psych, we're all starting in that, as babies, we do have them all sort of mixed together. And then we're going through this process of like figuring them out, or like, so you mentioned evolution earlier. Like, is this something with evolution, or are we being pruned by society? Like, are we just learning what senses to focus in on by the way that people around us are acting when we're babies? Or is that just you arrive at the same senses, just raised alone in the woods with no other humans around?
I mean, this is the nature versus nurture question, or similar to it. I think people have underlying DNA. And this is epigenetics, is that basically we have DNA that's going to form how most of our brain cells and how we perceive the world around us and everything. But that when we have experiences in the world, it facilitates certain genes to be expressed in certain ways and everything. And if you think about coming back to a baby and crying, our first form of communication is crying in the world. Like that's the only way that we can communicate. And I did my undergrad thesis on crying in therapy and things like that. And we found that like there's different types of crying that people communicate through tears. They can be frustrated, which means that they want change, or you can be tears of joy or tears of despair, just accepting the grief of something. So we learn to communicate in this way. So it makes sense that other senses would also develop over time in reaction to our environment. I think also an area where we could research this is with people who are blind versus people who regain sight later in life, and measuring, are they able to visualize things as easily? Like, how do people who are blind who regain sight, like, does it take them years to develop the ability? Does it matter how old they are when they regain their sight? Like those kinds of questions, I think, could help to shed light onto getting evidence for what we're talking about.
Does anyone have any version of this that they're willing to sort of talk about, like the unique way that your mind is functioning? You mentioned a couple that I thought were interesting, like that some people, the way that they think is that they're actually having a conversation in their head, right? It's not that they're seeing things, but there's like dialogue happening. Like that to me is like very interesting, because I don't have that, right? Like I don't have a dialogue going on in my head. And so to imagine that's the way you're experiencing most of life,
it feels so intuitive. You don't really think that you're not seeing things or that it's a conversation, but that is kind of what it's like. Yeah, it's so hard to imagine. Like, I just wonder, could we ever alter our brains so we could actually see the world in somebody else's view, or is it just, are the brains too complicated to ever even have a hope of experiencing what it's like to be in? I mean, I guess VR is a start.
VR is a start, but it's like, it's still like we're almost like the cave. It's like we're all putting the allegory of the cave. We're all putting a helmet on, which is projecting shadows, and we're all seeing the same shadows. But the way that they're going into our minds is still different. So like it's still not as good as whatever it's going to be like when we're actually sending some kind of signals between brains. Like this has made me question neurolace and the hive mind so much, because now it's impossible for me to imagine. Like, how could we share thoughts? Like, would I understand thoughts coming from your head? Like, maybe not. Like, I don't know if I could adapt to that, or if that's something that would just be so foreign and I've lived my whole life without it, that it would be impossible to sort of mix in with the way that I'm been thinking my whole life.
Good in the future, some sort of supercomputer, like upload your brain and alter the code so you could have a similar set of senses. I just think because our whole personality is built around our view of the world, it's just like, I think it would drive people mad. I don't know if you'd have to change your personality, and I don't know if that's possible. I mean, except for very slowly.
Well, so Sarah was saying that in regards to adjusting to mental communication, I think as with any other method of communication, a common ground found. So I guess eventually we would adjust.
I can't picture in my mind's eye what that means or what that looks like.
Yeah,
it is.
I mean, aphantasia about it.
Yeah, I just assumed we could speak to each other's minds, but if I actually try and imagine it, I guess I just think of voice. Like
it'd be their voice. Yeah, that's a good point. A different voice than your voice.
Okay, so David Eagleman is this neuroscientist, and his team built this backpack that puts pressure on your lower back because that part of your skin isn't used as much. And then they're using it to give people certain senses, like feed data into it. Basically, the brain you can input anything into the brain. Oh, like to give people hearing. It's just a bunch of like pressure signals. And even though at first it makes no sense, your brain eventually figures out what it means and it communicates something to you. So I think it might be the kind of thing. It's just like your brain can take different inputs. I mean, all brains, not just human brains. And then eventually it'll just feel like a voice, I guess. And your brain will interpret it as vocal or visual. Maybe it's something like that.
So that's what Sarah is sort of talking about. Like that's the translation process.
Yeah, her comment was that, so for example, you see the word brown, but you think of a shade or saturation. So the thought would just be a more focused method to which we could adapt.
But like that's such an easy example, Sarah. Like I wonder if we were actually beaming a complicated, like if I had to beam a childhood memory into your mind, if it would make any sense. And like I've heard this other.
So I did a whole presentation on this researcher from University of Washington who got in a lot of controversy because she was talking about false memories. Because there was a time when there was like a Freudian kick and people were doing psychodynamic therapy with patients, and there were like these memories of abuse coming up and stuff that like weren't necessarily actually there, which I think puts a horrible stigma on the actual abuse that happens, more common than people realize. But the idea of a false memory in that area of cognitive science is a whole area that people are looking at, is like, how do you implant a memory into someone's head and have them actually remember it?
So just from Sarah mentioned, is vocal communication easy to a baby? Because we learn. So a baby learns vocals, so we could learn to.
But that's a process, right? So like I wonder, to successfully send my childhood memory to you, I wonder if this would be an activity we try over the course of years. Because like it wouldn't just happen in an afternoon. I could just go, hey Sarah, check this out. Because it wouldn't make sense. But maybe but
mine
maybe
really
through time.
aren't visual, so it'd be hard to send.
Yeah.
And man, I'll be so curious to feel what it is you're feeling, right? Because like the image wouldn't show up, so I would have to.
The ultimate
I don't know.
empathy.
What would that look like? All right.
Saying about the test where they've shown visuals from somebody's brain and shown that you can actually see it, but that's a direct visual input. But if you're actually taking a internal visual, like I'm curious if people with sharp visuals could send their memories to other people easier, because I really think I don't see my memories very well, so I think it'd be impossible to extract from me.
If you had like AI in the middle, like translating, maybe that's like a solution. Sir.
Yeah, the thing I wanted to say to kind of continue on what Laozi was talking about, a brain's ability to accept extra input sent to it, that reminded me of this thing that Sony had patented, which was basically labeled as a device that uses ultrasound to inhibit signals being sent out of the brain, and a second signal to change what is being input into the brain. And apparently during their patent that I read through the whole patent and things, it would describe as multiple sittings where you would be calibrated specifically to that headset.
There's a paper that was published by Giuseppe Riva in Italy about sonomics, and he's talking about exactly that, using ultrasound to in a suit with different places in your body and projecting sensory signals onto your body. He's calling that sonomics, which is like just like the 2015 was coining a term, aphantasia. Like he's actually published, I think, like a month ago about this. It was a similar kind of thing in academia. So that's really interesting.
Were you saying that it was dampening the signals that were leaving, or how were you describing that?
Yeah, there would be two signals that would go through. One is an inhibitor signal that stops signals going out from the brain to the rest of the body, and a separate signal for input directly to the brain.
There's no way
this is misused.
Yeah, there's definitely no way that can be misused, But
shit, I didn't realize. I didn't know how close we were to this happening.
Yeah, they're actually, like, with how technology is advancing, something like Sword Art Online or something could happen within. It's predicted to be around like 2030, 2040.
Well, I'm hoping
So
it's
about 10 years
2030.
from now. Well, 10 to 15.
Well, I mean, without the trap you in or you're dead thing.
Shit, I forgot what I was going to say. What were you saying?
Oh man, no. Wait, I forgot what I was going to say too. It's not good.
Oh, we were
I was
closing
like, well,
down,
and
so
I
it
was
was
like,
probably some kind of conclusive statement. It was like
yeah,
a
but
good.
it escaped me. It wasn't a nugget. This was a fail. Well.
Oh,
Yes.
oh wait, we got.
Thank you
we
guys.
got
Let's
we
take
got
a picture.
nugget. No, wait, we got a
Sarah
nugget.
has a
We
nugget.
have a nugget.
Sarah has a nugget.
Yes.
So
Yeah, let's send them
all
a nugget.
all these moments will be lost, like tears in rain.
Wow.
Thank you, Sarah.
You just came up with that just
All
now.
All those moments will be lost in time. Like tears in rain.
All right, you guys, let's line up for a picture. I don't know where the best place to go in this world is. If it looks good to Ghoster.
If it doesn't look good, I'll shrink if you need me to, Ghoster.
Can we get some of the anime crowd spaced out a little bit? All you see is a white.
Anime, space out.
Shaders.
You're too bright.
Aphantasia, or whatever that word is on the tree. So 1, 2, and